used method for quantitatively measuring the dynamical structure of two neural circuits. So to motivate why we developed DSA, I'd like to start with an example. Here I've plotted noisy samples from 3 different two-dimensional dynamical systems, as well as their condition averages in the darker coloring. And they look very similar, right? So maybe it would be reasonable to say that they're doing the same thing. But in fact, they have totally different intrinsic dynamics that can only be identified via their noise perturbations. The first one is a bistable switch, which can be used to model perceptual decision-making. The second is a line attractor, which can be used to model how the brain tracks eye position. And finally, the last one is a point attractor that can be used in stimulus filtering or to model associative memory. And this example raises a problem for a wide range of pipelines in computational neuroscience that require comparing systems. And it's not limited to this specific example. It's incredibly easy to construct systems that disentangle geometry and dynamics. And yet, state-of-the-art geometric comparison methods all only depend on their geometry, which means that these cases are in some sense adversarial for them. Here's a list of some well-known neural comparison methods, all of which only rely on the geometry of your data. And this means that if we were to use them in the previous example, we wouldn't be able to tell that the systems are different. Our new method, called Dynamical Similarity Analysis, or DSA for short, can identify from data whether two systems have the same dynamical structure, regardless of what their shapes are. To do so, we leverage the theory of delay embeddings, which allow us to capture the full dynamics of a system, even when we are only able to observe a subset of dimensions, as is visualized here with the Lorenz attractor. We also leverage the theory of Koopman operators, which allow us to capture a globally linear representation of the system's dynamics via embedding observations of those dynamics into a much higher dimensional space. But what do I really mean mathematically by dynamical similarity? The notion of similarity we chose to emphasize is called topological conjugacy, and I want to provide some intuition here. Suppose we have 2 different dynamical systems called F and G over different manifolds M and N. These 2 systems are conjugate if you can take any point S in the first system, map it to a point psi of S in the second system, evolve that point in N with G, and then map it back to M. And the resultant point will be the same as if you had just evolved within M via F. So this type of conjugacy preserves all types of dynamical structures, like fixed points, limit cycles, and transitions between them. So this is described via the equation below, and is the notion of equivalency that DSA seeks to capture. And next, I'm going to talk about how the method actually works. So DSA is very straightforward algorithmically. Given time series data from 2 different dynamical systems, first, we nonlinearly embed these into a higher dimension, and for the most part, we use delay embeddings, although other embedding methods could work here as well. Then we fit a linear model to the embeddings for next step prediction. And finally, we compare the operators from these linear models via this similarity metric here. And we call this metric Procrustes analysis over vector fields because it looks very similar to the famous Procrustes analysis. And notice that the metric actually looks like the equation for conjugacy itself. In fact, conjugacies between linear systems are themselves linear maps, and their dynamics matrices are related via a similarity transform. And so this is much easier to optimize as opposed to any arbitrary nonlinear conjugacy. So let's see this in action. Using the 3 systems I introduced in the beginning, we see that Procrustes analysis, when applied pairwise between sampled systems to produce a dissimilarity matrix, and then visualized here with MDS, cannot discriminate the 3. However, DSA is able to almost perfectly distinguish them, as reflected by the MDS and quantified via linear classification. Now let's see the converse. We simulate a 100-dimensional ring attractor neural network, which has been experimentally identified in the brain for tracking head direction in both mice and fruit flies. After simulating, we applied a smooth, nonlinear deformation to this data. This does not change the ring topology, but increasingly warps the geometry and increases the extrinsic dimensionality as this deformation parameter increases. We then compared these data at each parameter value to the smallest deformation parameter, a value of 0.1. And what we see is that while Procrustes increases smoothly, as expected, DSA stays very close to 0, indicating that it can identify these dynamics as equivalent. We also wanted to demonstrate that DSA is sensitive to topological changes, such as the tearing of a ring. To do so, we applied a different transformation to our ring network, such that when this transformation parameter is less than 1, the ring is broken and is in fact a curved line attractor. Only at 1 or close to 1 due to noise does the network behave like a ring. As before, we compared the system at different parameter values to the baseline, And we find that, unlike Procrustes, DSA only jumps up away from 0 when the parameter is close to 1, or the ring closes. So this is strong evidence that DSA can actually capture topological conjugacy. DSA is also able to confirm that a ring is the most similar attractor topology to the real mouse head direction circuit. To verify this, we simulated multiple n tori with n from 1 to 4 by taking the direct product of n independent ring attractors. We compared one mouse's neural recordings across subsequent days to each attractor network across a range of DSA hyperparameters filtered by a goodness of fit metric. Lower here is better, and the dotted line indicates inter-day consistency across the neural recordings. While none of the models actually reach the inter-day floor, the ring is significantly more similar to the neural data than any other topologies, and the distance monotonically increases as we add more rings. Lastly, we wanted to demonstrate a unique use case for DSA. In artificial neural networks, learning rules instantiate dynamical systems over the network's weight and activity spaces. We tested whether DSA could discriminate between learning rules based on data sampled from these systems across training. To do so, we borrowed a data set from Aran Nayebi's 2020 paper, in which he trained a variety of large-scale CNNs on different tasks with 4 different learning rules. The data set consists of statistics from the convolutional layers across training, such as the mean activation of units in that layer. We applied DSA pairwise to sample data from networks based on their learning rules, and we visualized the result here with the same MDS clustering analysis as before. The learning rule types clearly cluster very well, and in fact, we achieved 80% on average test accuracy when applying simple logistic regression over this similarity space. This result also holds up when studying learning dynamics in a different set of networks from another paper. And now we're actively exploring this in neural data. Cool, so that went very fast, which is hopefully a good thing. But just to wrap up, dynamics and geometry are distinct features of neural data. Our method, dynamical similarity analysis, is able to capture topological similarities in dynamics, which is to say that DSA can identify when the shapes are different, but the systems are doing the same thing. We have open source code that has a scikit-learn style API and is also GPU accelerated. I will also be giving a more in-depth talk in one of the workshops on Tuesday. So thanks for listening, and I'm looking forward to your questions.
Thanks, Mitchell. We're about back on schedule, so we should have time for a couple questions. Yes.
Hey, thank you very much for the talk. I think it will be very useful to compare dynamical systems. So I came across another a work from another group where they didn't do any delay embedding or decomposition, where they used I think vector field alignment. So what's your opinion on that?
This is like a very recent paper.
This is a pretty. I think they cited yours.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think that paper is really interesting, and honestly, I thought about that idea, I think, but the reason why I chose to go with this method is because it's purely data-driven.
Yeah.
What I remember about that paper is you have to map points from like 1 to 1 across the system.
Yeah.
So you have to have direct control over your dynamical systems, whereas ours, you just need data. So I think their model is awesome, but I think when it comes to neural data, it might not work as well. Yeah, I'm not sure.
Yeah, thank you very much.
One more, and the next speaker can start making their way to the stage.
Thanks, looks really cool. Just a quick question.
Yes.
In a sense, in the normal Procrustes, you compare states, and here you compare the derivative of the state in a sense. How sensitive is this to noise, because you're sort of using derivatives?
Yeah, so you're saying that DSA is measuring the derivatives. Right, so I think there's some like optimality criterion on the variance of the noise. If you get too much noise, it's obviously going to blow up, and if you don't have enough, then you can't estimate the dynamics like to be sufficiently rich enough. So I think there is some optimal value, but I haven't quite measured what that would be.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Okay, great.
Cool.
Thanks, Mitchell. Okay, moving along, we have Nicolas Skatchkovsky.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me today. I'm really excited to be talking here for my first ever Cosyne. So I'm a postdoc in Florian Iacaruso's lab at the Crick in London, and that's a joint work with Sadra Sadeh from ICL. So the story starts here. It might be a wild guess, but I think some of you in this room might be recording from neurons, or maybe you have some colleagues that record from neurons. And a problem with analyzing neural data is that it's really hard. And some of the reasons for that are very fundamental in the sense that neural signals are very high dimensional, they're temporal, they're discrete, and they're non-uniformly sampled signal. So all that nice digital signal processing framework that you have from, like direct combs that you can, on which you can do convolution, Fourier transforms, and so on, doesn't really apply here. Also, from a more biological point of view, there's the fact that neural representations are distributed and sparse. They're often found in population dynamics, but sometimes single spikes are really important. Also, there's the fact that most of the variance is explained by mostly by behavioral parameters. So if you're interested in sensory processing, in decision making, cognition, that sort of things, you might not have so much to rely on. But good news, it actually seems that by looking at a few dimensions, you can actually find most of the relevant variance. So there's a lot of very nice papers that do just that. And for instance, if we look at this one from Juan Gallego's lab at ICL, they found that by looking at electrophysiology data in monkeys performing the same task, they can actually align the latent spaces obtained from dimensionality reduction techniques on the spiking data, and they can compare the data from these different monkeys to obtain robust results. The problem is that to obtain those nice results, you need to do a lot of work. You need to do your recording, of course. Then you need to do some pre-processing, for instance, some Gaussian smoothing. Then you need to apply your favorite dimensionality reduction technique, here at PCA. Then you need to do some more pre-processing to align these latent spaces. And finally, you get your exploitable results. And you need to do that over again for every session that you record. So that's a lot. And even if you want to relate that to behavior, you might need to train a neural network and still to predict behavior across animals. The results are maybe not that good, around 30% in this paper. And I think there's really a fundamental reason for that, which is that dimensionality reduction techniques completely ignore the structure of neural recordings. And that's because they rely on this standard mathematical framework of continuous Euclidean spaces, but they ignore either the information encoded in single spikes, for instance, if you do PCA with smoothed signals, or they ignore the sequentiality of the signal. For instance, if you do contrastive predictive coding, or that kind of stuff. So how do we find these nice representations of the data that account for all of this? Well, there is a type of machine learning model that is very trending these days. You've heard about it quite a few times, I think, already, and that's transformers, which are the models that power, for instance, ChatGPT. And these transformers rely on one mechanism in particular, which is called self-attention. The idea behind self-attention is to find out what's important in your input signal to know what to do with it. So for instance, if you have textual data, such as the sentence, the big red dog, you're going to compute an attention matrix, which is going to tell you for each word which are the other words that are important in the sentence to make syntactic sense of this. So for the, that's the definite article which relates to dog, and so on for the adjective. You can also do that for images, for instance, and then you'd obtain an attention mask that tells you what's important in the image to be able to classify them, for instance. How do we do that on neural signals? The techniques that are used for these types of very structured data might not apply because, as I was mentioning, you might have like those very sparse representations in which you have information encoding in population, but also in single neuron and so on. But we had the idea to use a core neuroscience principle to compute attention, and that's Hebbian learning. The idea is to take all the neurons in your recording and to postulate a possible synapse between all of them. And so here you now have a presynaptic neuron at the top, a postsynaptic neuron below. And so for each spike, you compute some trace that decays over time in the absence of more spikes. And I won't go through the details of how to compute STDP, but essentially you can compute this attention metric between all of the neurons in your recording. So you put all of that in a big matrix, and then you pass it through more neural network layers, and that forms the neural transformer encoder that we propose in this work. But because we're interested in latent representations and not just in predictions, we're not using transformers, we're using an autoencoder, and so, yeah, we get Sparks, our model. That's a sequential predictive autoencoder for the representation of spiking signals. That's a mouthful, but makes up for a nice acronym. So as you can see here, we can train it via supervised learning, for instance, by using the behavior of an animal, but can also use it as a more traditional autoencoder without feeding it any information about the behavior of the animal, and just using the neural recording itself as the target. Does it work? Well, we've trained it on this monkey reaching data set in which we have 65 neurons recorded from the somatosensory cortex of monkeys performing a reaching out task. And so you can see on the right the hand position which we're going to use as a target. So that's our target again. And that's the kind of latent embeddings that we obtain with Sparks. So when I say interpretable here, you can see that they can be directly related to the actual position of the monkey. If we look at how the state-of-the-art performs on this data, that's what you get. And yes, you do get like these very nicely separated trajectories as well. But you obtain that sort of like ball-like structure that might not be so relevant to this particular recording. And also you see that it does a lot of wonky stuff around the beginning of the recording and towards the end as well, where our technique provides much smoother embeddings. I talked about unsupervised learning a bit earlier, and that's what we obtain with unsupervised learning. And you can see that across different conditions, the trajectories are still very neatly separated. And it kind of looks like they're all crushed into a single plane, but that's just because that's a 2D representation of a 3D figure, and they actually kind of nicely separates in different planes. So that was the first thing I wanted to talk about, interpretable embedding. Then we can also actually obtain like nice predictive accuracy from this. And again, if we compare to the state-of-the-art with a 3-dimensional latent space, we obtain 90+% accuracy on this task for decoding the position of the hand. And if we look at the best they obtain with 5 times more latent dimensions, we still beat them by a bit of a margin. And even if we look at our unsupervised model, it still beats the state-of-the-art with the same number of latent dimensions. And I think the unsupervised version of the model might be very interesting for a lot of you here, because the main idea is that it will allow you to discover features of your data without fitting any behavioral parameters, if you maybe don't have access to any. So to show that, we tried to see how well we could predict the different variables that were in this data set. So you have hand position, direction, hand velocity, moment of the force on the joystick, and the length of the muscle of the arm. And so on the y-axis, you can see how well the unsupervised version of the model predicts these different variables. And then we trained separate supervised models using each of these targets. And you can find the supervised prediction score on the x-axis. And so you can see that the two correlate really well with a Pearson correlation score of 0.98, which actually means that in these latent embeddings that are produced with only 3 dimensions, our model is able to weigh very well how how much of each of these variables is encoded in the actual neural signal. And the last thing I wanted to talk about was this calcium imaging data that my colleague Alex recorded. So the mice are presented with this film on the right, and he recorded from the visual cortex. And we do two things here. We do prediction of the frame ID first. So that's what we obtain. So on the left, you can see that within the same session, we repeat, I think, over 100. We show the film over 100 times, and we obtain over 95% accuracy in predicting the frame ID in left-out trials. But even across different sessions that can span several days, we're still able to find the frame IDs with over 70% accuracy. Second thing that we looked at was to do frame reconstruction, which is a somewhat hard task, just using our model, and so that's what it looks like. So you'll see that for the same session, we are actually able to capture most of the even like very fast-moving elements of the movie, and across different sessions, we're able to retain most of the scene information, although you might see that sometimes the model switches from one scene to the next a bit faster, and we're still investigating that. So take-home messages: interpreting your data is hard, and most of the existing techniques are not that good at it. But we've worked on this tool that we hope you guys are going to be excited about, which offers both supervised and unsupervised training directly on the raw recording, so no need to have a lot of pre-processing anymore. We obtain these directly interpretable, low-dimensional latent embeddings. We obtain very high predictive power of only tens of neurons, actually state-of-the-art predictive power. You can find stuff in your data in an unsupervised fashion, and we find robust encodings across repetitions, sessions, and animals. Thanks a lot for your attention. Thanks a lot for sticking around so late. And thanks to Flo and Sadra, my PIs, and to people in my lab, in particular Alex, who recorded the data, and Louis, who works on this with me. And hopefully, this will all be out in preprint and on GitHub very soon. Stay tuned on sparks.cric.ac.uk. The website doesn't work yet, but it's going to be out soon. Thanks.
Great, maybe time for 2 questions. The race is on here.
Hi.
I think.
Okay, yeah. I'm wondering, since you're using self-attention on the raw recordings, whether you can learn anything about the important features of the neural responses, maybe separately from firing rates or when firing rates versus spike timing is important from what the model is doing.
We've looked at that, and we haven't found anything very conclusive. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Maybe the next speaker can come up and start switching laptops. Where's our next photo? Any other questions? Okay, maybe thank our speaker. Okay, and in the last talk of the session, we have Antara Majumdar. Take it away.
Good evening, everyone, and thanks to the organizing committee for giving me an opportunity to present our project titled Graded Representation of Economic Value Across Regions and Projections of the Frontal Cortex. We often make economic decisions in our daily lives, usually with uncertain outcomes. Say you're looking to invest some money, you could invest in options that offer a high return, but these often come with significant financial risk. Alternatively, you could choose to invest in options associated with a smaller magnitude of return, but that promise a safer and more certain outcome. Making economic decisions such as this requires us to evaluate and integrate different economic variables such as reward magnitude and risk to inform our choices. And a key question that arises here is, how do neuronal signals represent economic variables? It's well established that the frontal cortex plays a critical role in economic decision-making. Early lesion studies in humans and non-human primates demonstrated that damage to the frontal cortex impairs decision-making. Since then, a raft of electrophysiological studies have revealed that neurons across the frontal cortex can represent a diverse range of economic variables across behaviorally relevant timescales. However, despite this progress, it remains unclear how these representations are structured within frontal cortex. One possibility is that different regions of frontal cortex encode different economic variables. And previous studies have found evidence that neurons in specific frontal regions represent distinct features of decision-making. However, these studies typically focused on a small number of neurons in isolated regions, making it challenging to compare representations across frontal cortex. Another possibility is that representations are defined by downstream connectivity. Indeed, several studies have suggested that projection-defined populations of frontal cortical cells are differently engaged during decision-making behavior, suggesting that neural representations are structured according to downstream computations. However, these studies generally focused on connections between specific upstream and downstream brain regions, making it challenging to disentangle the relationship between projection and region-specific signals. Zooming in even further, it is possible that other factors, such as cell types, may shape frontal neuronal representations. In this project, we sought to investigate these first two questions, and to achieve this, we developed a visually guided task to probe economic decision-making in head-fixed mice. In this task, mice were presented with 3 abstract visual stimuli predicting different magnitudes and probabilities of reward. One stimulus predicted a large reward delivered with 100% probability and thus signaled a guaranteed large reward. Likewise, a second stimulus predicted a small but guaranteed reward and thus yielded a smaller expected value. Finally, a third stimulus predicted a large reward delivered with a probability of only 50%, yielding a stimulus with the same EV as the certain small reward, but higher risk. The correspondence between abstract visual stimuli and trial types was randomized across mice. Mice were head-fixed in front of a small screen with their 4 paws on a rotating wheel, and there were 2 possible trial types in this task. In the first trial type, which is the single stimulus, mice were required to move the stimulus to the center of the screen by turning the wheel, prompting the delivery of the corresponding reward. In the second trial type, mice were presented with 2 different visual stimuli simultaneously and had to make a choice between them by moving one of the stimuli to the center of the screen. We investigated whether mice were able to accurately select visual stimuli and were sensitive to the expected value of presented options. Examining performance on single stimuli trials confirmed that mice were able to move a single stimulus to the center of the screen, as signified by high levels of accuracy across all 3 conditions. Critically, however, even with only 1 stimulus to choose, we found that animals' performance scaled with EV. Mice displayed the highest accuracy on trials corresponding to the greatest EV, and no significant difference in trials corresponding to the same EV. On 2 stimuli trials, when choosing between stimuli with different expected values, mice consistently selected the stimulus with the higher expected value, indicating that they made rational economic decisions. Conversely, when choosing between stimuli with the same EV but different risk, there was no preference for the safe or risky option at the group level, despite considerable variability in risk preference across individual mice. Overall, our behavioral results demonstrate that mice make economic decisions between abstract visual stimuli, similar to previous studies in non-human primates. Having established this behavioral task, we next investigated the representations of economic variables across the frontal cortex during this task. We used neuropixel probes to record the activity of thousands of neurons across several regions of frontal cortex in mice performing our task. We observed that a majority of neurons across all frontal regions showed modulations of their responses by task events. Examining individual neuronal responses to different stimuli, we identified a subset of frontal neurons that were differentially modulated by stimuli with different EVs. For instance, you can see that the firing rates of these two example neurons scale with the EV of the stimulus, showing a large response when presenting a stimuli with high EV and a small and comparable response when presenting stimuli with low EV. To investigate these representations at the population level, we employed a linear population decoding analysis to test how well we could decode economic value from neural activity across all recorded cells at the time of stimulus onset. We found that we could decode which stimulus was shown on the screen with a high level of accuracy across all conditions. Notably, we observed that the decoding accuracy was greater when distinguishing between stimuli with different EVs compared to stimuli with the same EV, indicating a neuronal representation of economic value rather than visual features of the abstract stimuli. Thus, population activity across frontal cortex distinguishes between stimuli corresponding to different economic values. We next sought to investigate the spatial structure of these representations across frontal cortex. We examined the difference in activation patterns between stimuli associated with high and low EV along different axes of frontal cortex. We found that EV coding was most pronounced in the dorsal but not ventral regions of frontal cortex, therefore exhibiting a dorsal to ventral gradient. Alongside this gradient of EV coding, we examined the representation of risk by contrasting the activation patterns to stimuli with the same EV but different risk. In contrast to the representation of EV, the representation of risk exhibited a medial to lateral gradient, with risk coding most strongly observed in medial but not lateral regions. These spatial gradients held across the posterior to anterior axes that we examined. Thus, population decoding in the frontal cortex revealed distinct spatial gradients. Dorsomedial striatum contributes directly to decision-making through its role in goal-directed learning and action selection. While the function for the claustrum is less clearly defined, recent studies have indicated it plays a role in the modulation of prefrontal cortical activity and higher-order functions such as cognitive control, attention, and impulsivity. To target these projections, we combined our decision-making task with an in vivo optotagging protocol. Optotagging involves delivering a series of laser pulses to stimulate the axons of opsin-expressing frontal neurons projecting to the claustrum or the DMS. We used a strict set of criteria based on existing literature to identify optotagged cells. In particular, neurons had to display a short latency and high reliability responses to laser onset that were significantly different from their baseline activity. And this method enabled the identification of a subset of frontal neurons projecting to claustrum or dorsal medial striatum during decision-making behavior. We found that the majority of optotagged cells were task responsive, and that a subset were differentially modulated by different trial conditions. For example, this claustrum projecting frontal neuron shows larger responses to the stimulus with high EV, but small and comparable responses to stimuli with low EV. Conversely, this DMS projecting neuron shows a reduced response to the risky stimulus and similar responses to the safe stimuli. Examining the responses of all optotagged cells revealed a dissociation in EV and risk coding in these two populations. Claustrum projecting neurons more strongly encoded EV, while DMS projecting neurons more strongly encoded risk. This differential representation could not solely be explained by the spatial gradients we observed across frontal regions alone, because projection-defined cells were identified across all subregions of the frontal cortex. Therefore, we observed that different projection-defined populations of frontal neurons differentially encode economic variables beyond the regions of the frontal cortex from which those projections originated. To summarize, we established a novel economic decision-making task in head-fixed mice and showed that different economic variables exhibited distinct dorsal to ventral and medial to lateral spatial gradients, and that projection-defined populations of frontal neurons differentially encode economic variables. Overall, our results demonstrate that the encoding of economic variables spans multiple scales of neural representation in the frontal cortex. I would like to specially thank Caitlin, Matthias, and Armin, and members of the Lak Lab and Butt Lab, and thank you all so much for listening.
Okay, time for a few questions.
No. Yeah, now it is. Thank you for a great talk. I was just wondering, so you have the risky option that had the same expected value as the low option. What if you'd had a risky option that had a higher expected value? Would that have been a way to kind of differentiate with risk-averse or risky mice? Like, I was just wondering if you thought about that.
Well, that's like a really good point, that we could influence, like manipulate that risk probability and other aspects, which we didn't in this scope of this behavioral task, but we noticed when you compare same EV conditions, there is a gradient of risk sensitivity, so some mice are more risk-seeking while some are more averse and some are more in the neutrality zone. So there is some of that, but it would be cool to try that for sure. Thank you.
Hi, great talk. I was wondering, did you have any sort of like modulation by like how thirsty the mice were in like different conditions in terms of like, yeah, like how satiated they were?
So yeah, definitely that's something that would be cool to look at, but we've we stopped the training when the mice are like clearly done being excited about the water reward. So I guess we could look into that a little bit further, like how the satiation like plays a role, but we haven't yet. So thank you.
Okay, if there's no more questions, let's
Cool, thanks.
And now we have a panel discussion.
Hello. Okay, so it looks like for the 12 to 15 people who have decided to stay for the panel discussion, you're in for a special treat. We are going to have a panel discussion on neuro AI, on the potential impact of AI on neuroscience and the potential impact of neuroscience on AI. And very soon now, we are going to demonstrate just how well organized we are by having the people who are members of the panel as well as our moderator come out to the stage. So I think what we should do is start with our moderator, Paul Middlebrooks, who is running on the stage. Woo! Give him a round of applause.
I think we're still miking people up, right?
Is that how it's going to work? Yeah. I think it's best if we each have our own mic. Otherwise, it's going to...
Yeah, we don't have enough.
Wow, this is a disaster. And so we're going to just keep talking now because we've noticed that if there aren't words coming out of the stage, people just take that as an opportunity to leave for an early dinner. So it is a great pleasure here to have the members of the panel, and Paul is actually going to start producing words to keep you here in the room.
The brain. The deep mysteries of the brain. Thank you for having me here. So the way this will work, I would encourage anyone who wants to ask questions, you can come up and ask questions anytime. It's going to be a very loose discussion. And I am going to force the panelists to introduce themselves in under 30 seconds each, please. And if you can, relate maybe your most embarrassing or poorest idea that you've had throughout your career. So many. Tony, I know you have one. You were telling me one earlier.
Wait, what is the assignment? Because in public, I've never actually been wrong. The people in my lab know that, it's not possible I'm an oracle. So what was the assignment exactly?
Your thesis.
My thesis. Right. Oh, okay. Yeah, I can tell you. So, all right. My name's I forget it. I think it's Tony Zador, and I've been interested in the intersection of neuroscience and AI since actually I was a graduate student, and my graduate thesis was looking around for the things that were missing in artificial neural networks that we could take from artificial neural networks, from biological neural networks and move to artificial neural networks. And the one I went with for my graduate work was dendritic computation. And although I had a lot of fun working on dendritic computation, I will confess that my conclusion was that that was not the key missing ingredient, although there's obviously much that one could take from dendritic computation. That wasn't the thing that was limiting us back when I was a graduate student. So that could be an example of me being wrong.
Way over 30 seconds, Tony.
Another way in which I was wrong, because I thought I was like in 26 seconds, so.
Go for it, Eva.
Hi. Oh, yeah. My name's Eva Dyer. I'm an associate professor at Georgia Tech. I guess in terms of what I've done wrong, yeah, maybe. So in terms of my background or kind of transition in, between AI and neuroscience, I actually started out in AI, but at that time it was called machine learning. And now it's kind of taken on a life of its own. So yeah, coming from machine learning and getting really excited about questions related to natural intelligence. And now I'm kind of coming a little bit around to the idea that we can actually use the brain to inspire AI. So kind of back and forth between the two spaces. So.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Kim Stackenfeld. I'm a research scientist at DeepMind, also affiliate faculty at Columbia. I do some neuroscience things, some AI things. This probably isn't the dumbest thing I've ever done, because that's got to be a really high bar. But I did originally, when I was picking a major, I was really interested in the brain. And I was like, brains are made of chemicals, so I'll study chemical engineering. And I really didn't examine that until like senior year, when I realized that most chemical engineers like design distillation columns, and the brain is not a distillation column. And then I did a hard pivot to neuroscience. So, you know, it was fun, but it was probably not the shortest path to what I wanted.
Alex Pouget, so you've already heard from me way too much, probably. I got into neuroscience actually from biology, completely different perspective, slowly drifted into neuroscience, became a failed experimentalist, so had no choice. If I wanted to stay in the field, I had to become a theoretician, which I did during my grad studies, and grew up. I'm part of this generation that really grew up at NeurIPS and got immediately exposed to all the theoretical ideas that emerged in the field, and it's very relevant to debate today, because that's been a big question that we've been debated for 30 years. Who is contributing to who? Is it machine learning that's helping neuroscience, or is it in the other directions?
Hi, I'm Jonathan Pillow. I am a professor at Princeton University in computational neuroscience. So my group focuses on statistical models of neural data. I don't actually work on neuro AI, so I'm not sure what I'm doing on this panel. I actually misread the invitation. I thought it was for a workshop, and I said yes, and it was only yesterday on the plane that I realized, okay, that's it. Anyway, so I don't know. I don't work on AI. I am a consumer of AI, and I'm eager for it to get a lot better so that it can do something like, you know, answer our emails for us. But I'm excited about the possibility of the deep learning revolution for understanding the brain. So I see a lot of really creative applications of ideas from AI or deep machine learning to untangle the computations that are going on in the brain. So that's my main emphasis.
And Blaise?
Hi, Blaise Aguirarcas. I am a VP at Google Research and the CTO of Technology and Society at Google. I don't know what that means exactly, but I'm trying to sort of figure it out at the moment. I feel like I've made so many mistakes, you know, scientifically and so on. It's really hard to narrow this one down. So I don't know. But I guess I will just say that along with many people, kind of at the intersections of AI and neuroscience, I thought that there had to be some kind of magical special sauce to intelligence. And I think that is actually my biggest mistake, but I've seen the light now, except most people haven't. So this is kind of a little bit of a backward one.
Okay, well, some of you have already touched on this. One of the things that we're going to discuss, although it's going to be very open and we can go down any road that we want, is the interaction between neuroscience and AI, whom influences whom. And I would just love to get your perspectives on this. I know some of your perspectives and that there's some disagreement between some of you. For example, Tony believes that neuroscience has historically and continues to influence AI. And I mentioned to him earlier that I think that neuroscientists desperately want AI to be influenced by neuroscience. So I'd like to get your perspectives. And I don't know, Jonathan, if you have a particular perspective on this, since you're uninvited now to the group.
I don't have a dog in this fight. I believe Jan LeCun's tweets when he says, the organization of, V1, Hubel and Wiesel inspired him to think about convolutional neural networks. So I think a lot of the ideas that went into the design of deep learning came from neuroscience, although I'm not part of that movement, so I take people at their word. I'll just say, yeah, I think I personally am excited by Tony's vision that there are still things that AI could learn from neuroscience. I don't really know, though.
So Kim, you pivoted from chemical engineering to neuroscience, and now you're doing a lot of non-neuroscientific machine learning work. Mm-hmm. I mean, from your perspective, do you agree with me that neuroscience is sort of a desperate attention seeker in this?
I mean, I might be one, but I think when I'm thinking, I do some stuff that's just like pure AI methods stuff. So when I work on that kind of work, I've trained as a neuroscientist. A lot of the batch of ideas that I draw from are neuroscientific ideas. I have personally found that thinking of both the brain and AI in the same brain is a useful thing to do, that like they're just kind of interested in different aspects of the problem and thinking about things in different ways. And so I have found there to be back and forth. That's kind of a weak statement because it's not saying like this is, anybody has some background that they use as a batch of inspiration for their ideas. Where I am right now at Google, at DeepMind, there definitely is a mood right now that's empirically got some backing of like, let's scale it up. We've got some good methods. Let's like pause on the science bit for now and like just keep making them bigger and see where we plateau. So that's not only really like not neuroscience inspired. It's just like more not super science. It's more like engineering right now anyway. So I have personally found myself more excited about using AI for studying the brain because we have this new batch of models. They're super cool. They can do a lot of they comprise really neat tools, and they comprise a new model class that should let us answer different conceptual questions. So that's where I've kind of felt like there's low-hanging fruit right now in the environment I am. But I've historically felt very strongly about neuroscience-inspired AI, so I don't really feel like I have a super consistent, this fundamentally is or is not in the long term going to be part of the process.
Do you think it's a healthy relationship? Yeah, or do we need counseling, as Tony said?
In a sense, no. I think one thing that could be changed is like neuroscientists definitely don't need AI to justify neuroscience. So I think sometimes that is a little bit of a tone. Like the reason this is an interesting problem is because AI can't do it. And that doesn't need to be the justification for a neuroscience project. Like understanding the brain is its own imperative. So if validation from AI is the main reason to do neuroscience, I would say that's not healthy. And sometimes, it's easy to want that relevance or validation, but I don't think most people who study the brain would say that that's their only reason. So,
Eva, you said that you've only come recently to appreciate that there are brains that could be useful for building better AI. I'm not sure how you phrased it, but that's an interesting perspective from me because I kind of think the opposite. Mm-hmm. So, how did you come to that perspective?
I mean, I think there's a lot of enthusiasm in, taking inspiration from the brain to build, more generalizable or robust systems. In general, I think it was like the scale at which we're going to derive that inspiration, and I think perhaps there has been a lot of, excitement about maybe like synaptic learning rules or understanding how, neural systems could, implement kind of a more biologically plausible learning rule, or how we can look at like circuits or kind of more like mechanistic implementations in the brain and then port them over to AI systems. And I think, to Kim's point, while some of those, tools have actually given us, some insights into kind of connections between the two, I think that AI as a field has like moved in a very different direction, I think, in terms of, using transformers or different architectures that no longer look like kind of neurally inspired units any longer. And so I think, it's kind of interesting because now it seems like the way that AI scientists need neuroscientists is coming more from this study of like complex systems, right? So now we have really complex transformers. They have all kinds of, information within them, but we still don't know like how are they solving these different rules. And so I think it's interesting to see now how neuroscientists and neuroscientists like perspectives are coming into just like probing black box systems. And so, maybe neuroscience is helpful for AI, but it might not be at the scale or kind of mechanistic level that we might have thought would be helpful before. So,
at the same time, and I'm not a panelist, so I'm not really in a position to disagree. Looks
like you are.
10 years ago, the brain was a convolutional neural network. 20 years ago, it was a Boltzmann machine. Now it's a transformer. Pardon?
Is a watch.
Okay.
Or a steam engine.
Or a steam engine.
So my question is, I mean, in a sense, this is the problem of looking under the lamp post, right, to find your keys where the light is. And every new model that comes out, neuroscientists seem to take on that model and say, oh, maybe the brain is that or does it that way in certain respects. And I'm wondering if any of you think that neuroscientists are too influenced by what's happening in artificial intelligence. Jonathan, you're nodding your head.
I mean, I do think there's a trend, right? You also see quantum physics is something we don't understand. Maybe the brain uses quantum physics. So there's a tendency, I think, to grasp for whatever complex technology, the steam engine, the telegraph, right? You look at the history of brain metaphors, and it often has been that people compare brains to whatever complex technology we don't understand. But I do think it's a fundamental difference in that we're making quantitative predictions. I mean, so people tried, based on the tale of Hubel and Wiessel's work, to build models. That was Mar's whole vision program, not to bash on Mar, was we're going to figure out how vision works by constructing a series of computations, and that largely failed. And now we have, it's not just a metaphor, in other words, I would say. So the fact that we can make we can discover what neurons in V4 or IT or in language brain areas are doing using these complex models that were trained on vast amounts of data, I think says something incredibly cool. It's different than just comparing it to technology we don't understand.
I feel like I'm much more bullish on this relationship than many of the rest of you. I mean, the moment when they diverged, when neuroscience and computer science diverged, was kind of after McCulloch and Pitts in 1943. So that was when we thought that the brain was a bunch of logic gates, and computers were also a bunch of logic gates, and and that was a point of convergence. And then things diverged, and AI sucked for many years because it was not connected closely with, or at least the mainstream of AI was not connected closely with neuroscience. And it only began to make progress again when they reconnected. And I think this is a general theme. Like good ideas come at intersections. Both AI people and neuroscientists are testing rigorous hypotheses. Neuroscientists test them by seeing if the brain does something like the theory, and AI people test them by seeing whether something built that way can work. And the two have consistently informed each other at every turn. The transformer is the first architecture that seems superficially like it is not informed by very specifically by a neural architecture. And I'm not even sure if we look at it in retrospect in a few years if we're going to find that to be the case. I think that multiplicative interaction, that thing that is at the key of transformers, we're now looking, and I think we're likely to find things in the brain that that do actually do that, and that dialogue is likely to continue. I think that the issue is that AI is now whereas AI was in the doghouse for so many years and neuroscience was making real progress. Now AI is finally coming into its own and making real progress, and there are status issues between the two fields. So I think it has more to do with that than with the actual intellectual exchanges.
And I completely agree. And just to amplify that, right? It used to be when I was in grad school, the term AI was reserved for symbolic AI. And I think that's what you mean when you say that. Like they didn't start, like AI, as we now use the term, didn't really start to work until we jettisoned the version of AI that had nothing to do with neuroscience and replaced it with what we call neural networks / machine learning, right?
We should go back to calling it cybernetics.
Yeah. So like just historically, right, the major advances that gave rise, just to remind those in the audience who don't know the history, right, the major advances that gave rise to modern neural networks were all inspired by neuroscience. So, the very notion of a neural network, it still retains the name, the idea that synapses are the locus of plasticity, those are the free parameters, right? The convolutional neural networks, which were explicitly inspired by models of how the visual system processes information, insights, Hubel and Wiesel, insights from, the basis of reinforcement learning came from neuroscience broadly construed, psychology, all of that. And so I think what we're noticing now is that now that AI actually works and is useful, to make it useful is an engineering task. And I don't think people are, at least I'm not seriously proposing that the 20% gain or even the 100% gain that we're going to see next week at whatever the next ML conference is going to be is going to come. What's that? 20%. Okay. That the big gains are going to come from there was this paper that showed that CCamp that cyclic AMP was involved in some, that's the key insight we needed. No, it's not going to be one-to-one, but rather when we come to the next stumbling block, right, that will be overcome by people who have thought deeply about how neuroscience solves similar problems and is able to overcome those. And an obvious one, which I'll just put out here, is the energy and efficiency of modern, I mean, this is the low-hanging fruit, right? This is the clear example of something that biology manages to solve whatever problems it solves with max, 20 or 30 watts, whereas it's how many, petawatts to train GPT-7. So I think that, we don't yet know where the next inspirations are going to come, but history tells us that with the exception of transformers, all the significant advances have come from looking deeply at neuroscience.
Yeah, so I think, of course, I agree that neuroscience has had, neuroscience had a great influence on AI over the years, and Tony gave you a lot of examples, but it's, if you think about it, all the examples just Tony gave you are 50 years old, 40 years old ideas. And that's my problem, is I think, yes, originally we had an influence on AI, but today you'd be hard-pressed to come up with modern neuroscience idea that is influencing AI. You don't see too many NERBS people attending this conference, but the other way around, we do continue to attend the NERBS conference, and I could come up with a very long list of contribution that came straight from AI that have completely changed the way we do neuroscience. And I'm sitting to one guy who's exactly in that tradition, and Kim is representing that perspective as well. We're really, the imbalance is striking, and it's been striking for 40 years. And as much as I would love to say that we are going to help AI, I don't think we've been very impressive in that respect, whereas in the other direction, it's completely obvious. And I think I want to make that practical. It's like if I were a funder and I had $100 million to invest right now, the big question is, should I put it into neuroscience hoping it's going to lead to the next wave of AI, or would it be a lot more, much better use of the money to give it to AI people to work harder in neuroscience and help us develop theory and analyze
Just
data.
point out that $100 million is enough to train one large language model. So the question is that really, do you really say that that's where you want to put your money, is like training the next high parameter large language model?
I'm not talking about like Google, I'm talking about like NIH and all those, the people who fund us, right? And it's not Google. In fact, from what I understand, DeepMind is basically shutting down the neuroscience section. I think there's a big sign there. I mean, like, and Kim is at NYU. Maybe I do, but I'll tell you, the word is out in London that you don't want to apply to DeepMind if you're a neuroscientist right now, that this is no longer what they want to pursue. I think there is a big sign there, okay? And OpenAI, I've got 4 members in my lab who are there, and they're not doing any neuroscience, and they're not attending talks in neuroscience. Okay, that's the reality of what it is. And so I think we have to be honest about this. I mean, it's nice. I like when Blaise says, it will happen, but it's a question we have to be practical, and that's why I'm talking in terms of dollars. Is that how you want to invest your money tomorrow? As much as I'd like to get money to work in AI, I'm not sure that's the best investment.
If I can just add, I mean, this is, in biotech, there are biotech companies whose job it is to take the advances that have been made in basic science labs and convert them into products that are useful for society. When you have a biotech company, you don't typically see a large wing of the biotech company, or for that matter, even a pharma company, which could potentially afford to, invested in deep basic research, because there's a pipeline. There is certain kinds of research that is high risk. It has a long tail of success in that most of the things that people try fail. A tiny fraction of those turn out to be important, and those are the ones that can potentially be commercialized. And this is, basically AI is now sort of sorting itself out into the natural scheme of things, where their time horizon is maybe 3 to 5 years, right? And that's engineering, that's not basic science. And there's a longer time horizon of basic ideas. So if the belief is that the current ideas, if scaled up, will allow us to achieve AGI, then indeed, there is no reason to look to neuroscience for insights. There's another possibility, which is that no, there's something missing, but the engineers will figure it out on their own. That's a real possibility. But the last possibility is that when the modern approaches, the current approaches, start sort of maxing out, that they'll realize that there's something missing, and that something missing will be something that we know nature has solved in some way because we are the thing that is being targeted, right? And so that's sort of the hypothesis.
I agree, Tony, and likely it's already in the room. I mean, you were saying, Alex, like, these ideas are 50 years old. I mean, it's true. Hubel and Weasel is old hat. Also, CNNs were still the state of the art in 2017. So, it sometimes takes quite a long time for things to go from the basic research to milking the cow. And the fact that what we're doing right now in industry is attracting a lot of money. I mean, I find it very sad to reduce the thing to economics, just as I find it very sad for people who are supposedly doing basic science for all of their grants to be about, if they're studying neural networks, it has to be about epilepsy, or if they're studying anything cellular, it has to be about Alzheimer's. I mean, it's not just about fixing old people, or sick people, right? It's also about finding out, like the really basic stuff that's important. Right, so I think we should keep our eyes on I'm sorry, I don't mean to disparage medical research. It's very important. No, I'm one myself, so I feel like I'm starting to be able to, like speak with impunity about it. But yeah.
You might think differently about Alzheimer's.
By the way, I have the microphone for your questions. So if you have a question, just come up and I'll hand you the microphone.
Yeah. So I mean, just to the point about the interaction with neuroscience at DeepMind, it's definitely true that it's shrinking a lot. It's not entirely dead, and it's pivoting in a couple of ways, which not just in the interest of mere self-defense here, but more just because it actually does have some meaningful points about the interaction with neuroscience and AI right now. A lot of the neuroscientists at DeepMind just went off and are doing machine learning now. Machine learning that was related to the kinds of things they were studying usually, but something that's more in the space of something Google cares about a little more right now. So language models, and just taking whatever kind of version they had and doing it that way. The folks who are still doing neuroscience are kind of doing that in a new way. Some are doing really cognitive science or neuroscience on language models, things that are kind of using neuroscience-y attitudes, but not on a neuroscience problem. Some folks me and Kevin Miller and Maria Eckstein and Zeb Kurth-Nelson, we're doing more things that are using AI for neuroscience applications. It's really not in the original spirit of DeepMind's neuroscience team, which was we're going to understand the brain so we can build AI. It's really more okay, now there's all this cool AI and people are trying to use it for AI for science. Neuroscience is a science, so it gets to be in that umbrella of AI applications. And there's really kind of two ways this works. One is AI as kind of a tool, find patterns, be a model of the brain. It's a big complex learning system. It can learn patterns about big complex systems. The brain and its study have a lot of those properties. Another big one is that we have a lot of external collaborations now, because a key advantage of being at DeepMind is seeing the machine learning stuff that's working and being hey, this would be a neat idea to gain insight on some question in neuroscience. That question is not always best explored in the industry setting where scale up isn't really what you need. It's people to think about it for a long time. But that's pretty much how we've been adapting ourselves for what you very accurately describe as this really different relationship. It wasn't exactly your words, but that's my gentler take.
Does anyone have a comment on that before I throw it to the audience? There's a line forming of questions.
All right.
Audience member number one.
Well, thank you. So besides the pessimism of some of the panelists, I wanted to ask if you find a common language that we can use both for understanding the brain and improving the engineering of the systems. So we see in neuroscience a lot of dynamical systems, maybe for theory as well, but we don't see it as much for AI. Are we stuck with just thinking of units that integrate information from other units? Is that the commonality, or do we see any other common language that allows to do the science and the engineering?
Well, I think that dynamical systems, is actually poised to make a pretty big comeback in AI. I mean, for one thing, we've moved from CNNs and things like this, right, that are just static functions, to encoders, decoders type models, which are autoregressive and which do implement a dynamical system. So I think that a lot of that classic, this classic, both dynamical systems and also even kind of basic ideas from physics, of some of the kinds that I was talking about earlier today, are poised to be a new sort of common language for us.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right, and I think that as AI starts to sort of address the kinds of problems that so far it hasn't been very effective at addressing, such as like controlling a robot, where we're like, haven't really made that much progress. I mean, some, but not like the dramatic progress we've made in image recognition and language processing. I think that things like dynamical systems and a lot of the shared vocabulary with neuroscience will begin to kick in. So, yeah.
So I have a question that's kind of inspired by the B talk from yesterday. And so a lot of the neuro-inspired AI is really, coming from a laminar cortex from mammals. And there are all sorts of other smart creatures on this earth that have radically different anatomical platforms, but they're still intelligent. And I guess I was just wondering, kind of writ large, if there are ever any instances of AI models that have been inspired by non-mammalian brains.
Moving on then. Sorry.
I'd actually like to give one example. So neural cellular automata are inspired by morphogenesis. So that's not even the brain at all. That's sort of, patterning with chemicals and local interactions. And I think NCAs are also a really important frontier, actually, in AI right now.
Yeah, and I guess one thing I'll add to that is that artificial neural networks, the field used to be called machine learning, hence the emphasis on learning. A lot of insects and a lot of invertebrates actually, bees are remarkable in how much they learn for an invertebrate. But a lot of invertebrates do remarkably well with relatively minimal amounts of learning. And I think that having lots and lots of neurons is particularly useful if you need them to learn a lot. But a lot of organisms work pretty well out of the box, and in some cases, C. elegans, they work with 302 neurons. And so I think that it is partly because of the style of AI that, where the focus is on learning a new task each time rather than getting really good at one task with a small number of neurons, that you see that kind of a difference.
Actually, your question made me think about this, and I think it's the opposite. Right now, AI is modeling insect intelligence. We are not integrating anything that's specific to mammalian cortex. We don't even have cell types, right? That's like one of the big questions. What, so many cell types? We don't have a laminar architecture with like all the feedback stuff. We barely even have the feedback between areas. And in fact, I'm hoping, and then I'm going to go along the lines of those guys, that perhaps that's where we're missing something where neuroscience might be able to contribute. But it's not for lack of thinking about it. There are many, many labs that are desperately trying to come up with good ideas on that. But nothing super convincing is emerging. I'm looking forward to Raj Rao's talk tomorrow because I know that he's been thinking hard from the control theory perspective. So maybe those ideas are going to emerge, but I think so far, what we're doing could work just as well for insects or mammals.
Is it my turn or no? Okay. I am going to try to phrase this question in a very open manner. I really want to take it broader, and Tony, I think we talked about this in my thesis proposal, but anyways.
You're just not a plant.
I am interested in neuroscience because I think it's intellectually interesting, and I also find great value in helping people with disabilities or with mental illnesses. Even if Blaze, you don't, it's okay. But I want to understand why you guys are interested in AI at a neuroscience conference, right? So maybe you find it intellectually interesting, which is also great, but or are you interested in the applications that it can provide, like Jonathan, to neuroscience, or whatever else motivations you have? Yeah.
All right, well, I mean, my own answer is really summed up by the famous quote by Feynman, something like, that which we cannot build, we do not understand. So for me, the reason for being interested in AI is that, I can BS all I want about my beliefs that this circuit works in this particular way or that particular way, but you don't really know until you've tried to build it. And I will say that, in the early history of, I guess, up to the 80s, vision researchers actually thought that, like, Hubel and Weasel and we're done. It's feature detectors all the way. And I was sort of at the tail end of watching vision researchers recognize that their very simplistic models of we just keep building a set of feature detectors and we have vision don't actually work, right? And they didn't really, it took them a generation to recognize that that didn't work, and that it took them actually trying to implement their ideas to realize that, well, there's more to it than that. And I think a lot of where we are in neuroscience has that flavor, especially our inability to build robots that can interact with the world really drives home how poorly we understand the entire system. So for me, the two sets of questions are really one set of questions.
I was handed the mic. I don't have much to add, given like a lot of the discussions that we've been having. I mean, I think for me, coming from kind of the AI side and coming into neuroscience, I saw an opportunity to be able to utilize like this immense set of tools to be able to derive new insights, both into disease, but also into brain function. And I think, in some cases, like, we're working with transformers and some of these models that aren't neurally inspired any longer, but I think it's through really trying to see kind of how far we can go in terms of reading out from the brain in potentially really exotic or maybe not neurally inspired ways that we can maybe start to just see what's possible. And I think opening ourselves up to that without the constraints of biology and using that to derive insights from brain data could also be a really promising direction, right? So once we see, these are the types of systems we need in order to decode or read out from the brain, then maybe we can actually use that as insight and go back to the neuroscience as well.
Yeah, I really agree with that. I mean, I like AI a lot as a field for neuroscience because it's a very nice frame of reference. It has a lot of cool models that can learn how to do cool things. I mean, like I guess the question of like why neuroscience and AI, like why did I guess that I couldn't tell. Yeah, I guess that's sort of both a personal like why is this interesting historically as well as like what do these fields objectively have to say about each other? And like you had a Feynman quote, and I have like a von Neumann quote. The von Neumann quote is, when we speak of mathematics, we might be speaking of a secondary language built on a primary language of psychology. I think I have always found the brain, or maybe in general, this like idea of an intelligent system kind of a intriguing idea because it scaffolds all other reasoning. And as someone who had trouble picking a major, that felt like the deepest and most like, fundamental problem to study at some level. They both have a lot of the same batch of problems.
We're looking for an Einstein quote now?
I was just going to say, I don't actually study AI, but I think I'm interested in information processing in general. So I want to understand how do we get long time scales. But we can ask that question about AI as well as we could about the brain. So there's been a surge of interest lately in Actually, maybe the successor to the transformer, arguably, is going back to linear state space models. So there's been how do we get long timescales in an artificial system? How do we get long timescales in the brain? How do we do context-dependent processing? So I think there are a lot of these kinds of questions that we want to ask. We could ask them equally in a complex brain or in an artificial system. So that's my interest.
Next question.
Okay, I'm going to ask two. I would like to. I'll ask one if I only have to. Okay. So I guess this question comes out of the talk of Alex Pouget that he gave today, which was talking about compositionality and all that, and that the solution in the end was just scaling it up more and more and more. If that's really the solution or not. But so I guess my question is, if you compare the resources that academia has and neuroscience, like we can't throw $100 million at training a neural network. So how would you see that academia or neuroscience can work together, or necessarily we might have to compete with the research that comes out of Meta, Amazon, Google, who can just throw more and more layers at this?
You can't. So, I mean, I think that there are two solutions. One of them is to collaborate, and that is becoming harder per Kim's point. It's I've sort of, I mean, you do have two Google people on this stage, so obviously there are a bunch of us who care, but but we're also in cow milking era. But I think that a more interesting answer is that maybe it's not just scale. I think that the relentless pursuit of scale right now is really interesting in the sense that we're going to see, how far that goes and where it taps out. I'm very curious to see how far it can go, and I don't see an obvious ceiling. But I also don't think that is the way we have solved it. That seems fairly clear. I mean, we consume a very limited number of tokens up until age 4, by which point we're linguistically competent. So there must be something, and we use 20 watts, if we're, at a stretch, right? So we're obviously doing things very, very differently. So I don't think that competing with the big AI labs at their own game is the way to go at all.
Before you ask your question, does anyone feel like I do that neuroscience is paying way too much attention to AI? Do you think, okay. You want to elaborate?
Like everyone's paying a lot of attention to AI,
no,
right?
In terms of using
I think you should be
AI
paying
to study the
attention.
brain.
I mean, these things go in phases, right? I mean, obviously, there's a pendulum. I think we'll have.
You brought up the pendulum, the old pendulum.
Yeah. How many posters did you see
But
today?
see, okay, so I was at a quote-unquote debate where the two participants were drunkenly going back and forth on these things. This was like 4 years ago, and the pendulum was brought up. And David Cicillo wasn't slurring his words when he said that, David, I hope you're out there, that that it's a pendulum, and right now AI is kicking neuroscience's ass. That was 4 years ago, and I think it's more so now. Like, the pendulum didn't know it could go as far.
There is no pendulum. AI has been influencing neuroscience for the last, throughout my career. I started in the late 80s, and all the ideas from AI, meaning machine learning, have been influencing us every single year. I actually don't see a trend. I think this is, I don't see a recent trend. That's what I meant to say. David is among the people who revived the kind of a neural network craze in neuroscience. So that's kind of what a new trend. But before that, there was this whole period of time where we worked on Bayesian approaches. That came straight from machine learning and from NeurIPS. So it's been a one-way highway. It's been very active for 30 years. So I don't think it's a pendulum at all. And I think it should continue, by the way, and we should keep on even inject more AI. And this conference was created in part with this idea in mind, is to inject massive amount of machine learning and AI into neuroscience. And I think we're successful in
Alex.
I do agree with that in general, but I've seen just even over the past 2 years or so, as being someone in AI that cares about neuroscience, I used to have a lot of AI researchers coming to me and asking me so what is the brain doing, and how does this work? And they were really thinking that neuroscience was going to help them to solve certain problems that they couldn't solve. And I think over the past 2 years, probably with transformers, scaling, like a lot of that kind of movement away from thinking about like new losses or new ways to train networks and just wanting to scale, I don't see as many of the AI researchers actually coming to neuroscience as much, or I see like a bit of a trend moving in the opposite way, at least just from my perspective and talking to people. But yeah, I mean, I think in general we've been influencing each other, but I've seen a little bit of a backslide over the past years.
I'm kind of bummed that we're talking about people having this very clear disciplinary allegiance. You know, I mean, most of the people who've made really cool advances in both fields have skills and competencies at both and have published papers that are interdisciplinary. And so I think this really, that we're even having the debate suggests a level of professionalization that's really counter to having new ideas, right, which always involve hybrids.
Yeah, I mean, to the point about like whether we're overdoing it on the AI stuff, I think we'll probably look back and be like, we really tried to put a square peg in a round hole in a lot of cases, but it's still, because it's new, because we can, it's new and it's clearly interesting, and we can use this to explain and try to do a bunch of things we haven't done before. It doesn't seem like an obviously bad idea for people to like really try stuff. It seems like a good period to be exploring it. And I don't know if, I think we'll probably look back and feel like we overfit, but I'm not sure if actually like we have totally a choice, or maybe it's still optimal to like be trying a lot of stuff out in this space.
Sorry, go ahead with the next question.
Wait, if I could just add to Blais's point, for those people who do think it's an interesting thing to be bilingual in neuroscience and AI, Cold Spring Harbor has a program for people who want to spend 2 years.
So I was asked to try to encourage Jonathan and Alex to, inject a little more edginess in, and I had a couple of questions that have been partially asked and answered, and I guess I'm only allowed one question. I will note just in passing that the concept of attention probably comes from psychology, and so transformers are probably not devoid of neuroscience in the Tony and Eric sense, at least of neuroscience. But I think, Blaise, you just kind of undercut me, because what I was going to say is I think this debate is ridiculous, and all of you guys have both contradicted each other and yourselves. And if we look at models where science works, it integrates ideas from many things, and it has to use tools from mathematics and statistics to understand systems that are complicated. I will point out that this becomes a problem when people become professionalized in academia. So even in neuroscience groups, even at Cosyne, there's not enough real interactions and collaborations between the theorists and the experimentalists. I'm very experienced in watching theorists come and collect data from some experimentalist and model it. There's no iteration, there was no tested hypothesis from the theory, and they go on to model the next thing and the next thing. Well, the experimentalists working on it.
Do you have a question?
The question is, if you're all really doing the same thing, and you all really agree that these things are interesting, why do we have this basic problem of integrating these things in even neuroscience, let alone between AI, whatever that is, because we are the model for intelligence, right? So it's going to be directly based on us. So there's still some kind of fundamental cultural problem that we're not overcoming in the way our data from the brain is collected and used with regards to the theory and vice versa.
I lost the question. Does anyone remember the question?
Was that a question? I didn't actually hear a question.
Thank you for the comments.
Yeah, but thank you, Eric. Yeah.
You guys are ridiculous. I think that was the sum, right? Go ahead.
Yeah, just want to short question. Just a quick comment. I think with regards to robotics, this year is going to be year of robotics, so we will see they do a lot of, I think, tasks that will probably surprise neuroscience as well. With regards to scaling, a lot of this system that works, it requires lots of engineering efforts, and this AI engineers the right CUDA kernel. But we don't do this sort of stuff in neuroscience. Maybe if we, borrow some principle from engineering, we can build an AI which is going to be different than the current AI, but we'll probably get there by scaling. I'm just wondering, what do you think about just doing a little bit of engineering in neuroscience and to scale this, try scaling and try different hardware? So yeah.
I mean, I can just say that we, in my lab, are currently trying to invest in these sorts of approaches of, you know, being able to train models on large amounts of neural data. And I think that this has been a major gap in the field of neural data analysis in some ways, where we do have to like fit a model for each new data set rather than actually being able to scale and combine them. So I think that, yeah, through the convergence of both of these fields, right, and like knowing what we need to do in neuroscience as well as how to train these large-scale systems, I think we are moving in that direction as a field. Yeah, I don't know.
Next question, please.
Hey, interesting discussion so far. Right now, when I look at the kind of phenomena looked at in AI and neuroscience, they seem a little bit different, at least in one way. There's probably more that you're aware of. And this is that AI thinks a lot about transfer. How do you transfer knowledge to new tasks, new data, et cetera? It seems like less of a focus in neuroscience. I could be wrong, though. If there could be if shifts in focus or paradigms would lead neuroscience to be more informative to AI, can you think of some? One seems like transfer, for example. That's my question.
Thanks.
Yeah, I think, I mean, so there's like a lot of times when people start talking about like what's new and exciting in neuroscience, a big thing is scale, that there's like all this data, we have tons of neurons, we can get them over really long periods of time. One dimension of scale that seems like it's challenging is having lots of, like getting an animal to perform a challenging behavior, getting it to learn something really complex and rich, seems like it's a big bottleneck. Speaking as a theorist and not an experimentalist, but like that's my impression. And I think like one dimension, if one wanted to go all in on the scale idea, which like there are other approaches and not everyone should do that, but it seems like that's a dimension for scaling up, and if we can get faster learning curricula, that would be nice. Maybe other, yeah.
I'll just say I think it's a great comment and something that's missing in neuroscience. We often train an animal to do one task and we study, you know, how they solve that task. And we don't think very much about, well, if they, I should say, there's a very nice paper from Byron Yu's group where they did look at different animals that had different training histories and seeing how that they actually solved the same task in different ways. So I think there's, part of it maybe is the necessity of neuroscience experiments, that animals, you know, mice don't live very long. And so we don't typically train them on 14 different tasks in a row. But I think the question of why we don't forget something when we learn a new task has actually inspired a lot of the ML research, the AI research about that. You know, we typically don't have catastrophic forgetting, where if I learn to ride a bicycle, I forget how to do jumping jacks. But AI does still sometimes.
Quick comment on this. So the huge revolution in AI has come from unsupervised learning, which turns out to include every task. And one thing that I really haven't seen happen very much, I think, you know, there was a big revolution, of course, in neuroscience when we started to be able to, you know, do awake and behaving recording, and from large numbers of units. But I haven't seen so much of that unsupervised revolution come to neuroscience, and that seems to me like a big opportunity, in the sense that the amount of observation that one can make grows by orders of magnitude when you're not, you know, just collecting your one bit of information, or like when did the tongue touch the thing, you know, for every experiment, but just, you know, measuring everything and discovering the latent variables in it. So that would be one idea, one thought.
Go ahead.
Okay, so yeah, you guys talked a lot today about neuro AI as trying to bridge ideas from neuroscience to AI or vice versa. But I wanted to ask, what do you think of the perspective of the new generation of neuro AI as a whole new third sort of type of science that's just trying to study information processing machines that are optimizable, more generally speaking? Because even before AI or before humans evolved, you know, information exists in the air just emergent from the statistics of the world. And a lot of ideas like Tishby, like Dr. Tishby's information bottleneck theory, or Dr. Carl Frinstein's free energy principle, I think kind of more tackle like this abstract information processing idea. So this is personally what drove me to this field, and I wanted, yeah, to see this discussion basically.
Yeah, I love that point, and I mean that would have been my answer to the what drove me to the field as well, or why do I do this? And I didn't mean to say anything bad about medical applications and stuff, but there is a search for fundamental principles here, and I think that if you either go down the route of physics is biology is not physics, it's not some grand unifying theory, or Wolfram new kind of science, like it's just going to be simulations that are unexplainable, and they'll be able to make predictions, but we won't be able to say anything about why or how. I don't think that that's the case. I think that there are general principles here, and that understanding them is not going to solve all of the pharmacological details of how to work brains in the right way to fix them, but it will tell us something about how real brains work and give us engineering principles that let us build things like them. And I think we're actually pretty close to some of those. So that's definitely my motivation.
Has AI influenced neuroscience in any negative way? Has AI influenced neuroscience in any negative way? All right, next question.
Well, it's kind of related to that. So I really like Alex's point of making things practical. And if we're not talking about donations, another way to make things practical is education. So when we're training the next generation of neuroscientists, we can only make them take so many courses. You have to give them some certain framework to work with. And I've noticed over the 8 years that I've been helping teach this course at UPenn that it used to be I would teach something about the brain, and the student would come up, oh, how can we bring that into these neural networks? How could that happen? More often now it's, oh, the brain does that, but my neural network doesn't need it. Why does the brain do this? And I have some colleagues who are absolutely horrified that that's been the change, and some who are extremely excited by this and think it should be more. So I guess the broader question is, do we think we need to pivot neuroscience into a much harder emphasis on ML, that we really should take that route, or is there a more balanced approach? What does that kind of look like in your opinions?
Yeah, I guess sort of to that question, and also the one that you raised.
Thank you.
Yeah, I just had to cue it. That gets to points about biological plausibility, and my background is more as a cognitive neuroscientist, and I haven't focused tons on biological plausibility, but that would probably be what a lot of people would say has been a downside of sticking too much to AI models, is like it makes it easy to focus on questions at a level that's maybe not biologically plausible, and you got to be kind of careful about the abstractions you're drawing. In terms of like the brain doing things that models don't do, sometimes maybe the reason is just a biological plausibility one. Maybe it's the literal biological materials, or maybe it's just something about learning in a single lifetime and having to like grow a brain out of almost nothing. So I don't totally know. We also don't know what's implicitly going on in all of these models, so it's hard to say exactly what they aren't doing for sure.
My sense is that we have to inject even more in the ML in the field through training, that neuroscience students should all have to take nowadays AI and ML courses. And unfortunately, it's not part of most curriculum that I know. And that's the future of the field. I think if you look at physics, any physicist who gets in the field, even if they want to be an experimentalist, they're going to be absorbing an enormous amount of theory before they're done with their study. And in neuroscience, it's quite remarkable that you can get in the field and right now know very little about the theories that are dominating the field. And I think it's just a reflection of the fact that we're a very young science that came from biology, and there was a sense that we really needed theory, but I think there is a really severe need for more theory in our field, and this conference was very much created with this in mind. It's trying to contribute to that and push in that direction.
We're short on time. I'm going to take one more question. Sorry for the three of you, but you can come up after, I'm sure. Last okay. Question.
A lot of pressure.
Time's
cool.
up. All right, next question.
Yeah, so I think it's really interesting that while we are talking about this mutualistic relationship between neuroscience and AI, there is this almost parallel mutualistic relationship between AI and cognitive science. And so and Alex talked a little bit about Josh's work, but I haven't seen too much here, and it's obviously Cosyne and not CCN, so maybe that's why. But I'm curious what you guys think about this sort of tripartite relationship, and how we as the computational and systems neuroscientists can think about what they're doing and maybe gain some inspiration and benefit from their work as well.
I'm really glad you brought up this point and that we're going to end on this, because I do think I've always been a big believer that we need neuroscience, Coxeye, and machine learning to crack the brain. And I always been frustrated that there's not enough Coxeye at this conference. It eventually led to the creation of CCN because a lot of other people were frustrated, and so they created their own conference. I don't think that's good for the field. I think it's keeping us separated when in fact we should all be arguing about this here. That's what I was trying to do with, like, by bringing Josh's work here. I know Tim Behrens and I argue about that all the time, and he keeps telling me, you guys need more cogneuro. And I'm going to end by saying that actually, if I had to put some money on who is going to influence AI, I think cogneuro and cognitive scientists might have a better shot in the next couple of decades than the neuroscientists.
I don't know. I mean, I think that on the one hand, like psychology experiments and things like this are really useful. So and even sociology experiments for that matter, the more quantitative end of it. But a lot of cognitive science is infected with Chomsky bullshit. And has really done, as Chomsky has done a lot to keep the field back and to inject repeated sort of false belief, just hold a lot of things back for years and years. So I think that sort of holding it up as a field, I don't know, I would want to like do a little sifting to get the wheat from the chaff kind of thing.
Blaise and I had this argument recently about Chomsky. The reality is we should not forget that before Chomsky was behaviorism, which was incredibly limited, and those guys completely changed neuroscience and cognitive science. But I would agree that they went too far in the whole linguistic thing and the way Chomsky. But I definitely think that those contributions were enormous, and that there are people who have been able, and again, going back to Josh, but I'm going to not be able to give too many names here on the fly, but there are many people right now in the field who have gone past that, understand neuroscience, are in the interface, and coming up with absolutely brilliant idea that we're not injecting in our work here, and that we should. But it's true. The Pinker and Chomsky of this world, or in the Fodor of this world, who I quoted in my talk, yeah, that's, I think, we can leave behind.
I've been strong-armed into asking you one final question, and that is, what will we be arguing about in 2044, in 20 years? Thanks, everyone, for oh, sorry. Does anyone want to hazard an answer?
I'm going to be the first to say I have literally no idea. I haven't been in this field as long as a lot of people in this room, but my limited experience has been characterized largely by like incredible rapid change. So I don't think I would have predicted where we are like 2 years ago, let alone 5. So I really don't know. That's scary because a lot of research is trying to make long horizon bets, and now is a tricky time to do that. But
well, I know something we're definitely going to be debating in 2044, which is the question of moral patiency for AIs. In other words, are they people? That's definitely going to be a debate in 2044.
For humans as well, perhaps.
Yeah.
And now a message from our sponsor.
Okay, thank you everyone for still being here. If this conversation makes you want to continue the conversation with some more potables, you are all invited to the Simon-sponsored social, which I've been told is in the restaurant at the conference center. I don't actually know where it is, but I think we can exercise some collective behavior. If you see a lot of people walking in that direction and you follow them, the likelihood increases that you will find the Simon social.
This is like lemmings. It's going to go into the water.